Well, thank you very much, Kim. Thanks to the organizers for putting the paper on the program, and apologies if you've seen this already in one of the other seminars. This is going to be a shorter version, so hopefully you won't get bored if you've seen this before. So this paper is called The Geography of Unemployment. And so, well, I better be, okay. So the starting point of this paper is that, cities differ a lot in their unemployment rates. And so, for instance, in 2017, the unemployment rate in Versailles, which is an affluent city close to Paris in France, was about 5%. But in the same year, in the southern city of Marseille, it was well over 12%. Now, it turns out these gaps are not special to 2017. In fact, they're highly persistent over time. And they're also not special to France because similar gaps and persistence have been documented also in the United States. And you can think of Boston versus Flint, for instance. Now, these persistent gaps are somewhat puzzling because in principle, both workers and employers could reallocate across space. And they may have important welfare consequences because we know that being exposed to unemployment is harmful, but spending a lifetime in a distressed labor market like Marseille could have dire long-run consequences. And policymakers seem concerned about spatial unemployment gaps because we see local governments spending billions of dollars every year to attract jobs. But at the same time, we know relatively little about the determinants of spatial unemployment differences. And so in this paper, I tackle three questions. First, why do we see persistent unemployment gaps across space? Second, what are the welfare implications of this dispersion? And third, in general equilibrium, then, what can we say about place-based policies that target high unemployment areas? And I propose answers to these questions in this paper in 4 parts. In the first part of the paper, I document that the unemployment rate is high in Marseille in France or Flint in the US, not because workers struggle to find jobs there, but instead because workers repeatedly lose their jobs in these cities. And even for similar workers in similar industries, differences in the rate of job loss account for over 86% of observed gaps in unemployment rates. And so this key role of job loss, even for similar workers, indicates that there are systematic differences in the type of jobs offered by employers across space, rather than differences just in the number of jobs. And so in the second part of the paper, I propose an alternative view of spatial unemployment gaps, one that emphasizes the key role of employer heterogeneity across cities. Different employers offer different types of jobs, and as they self-select across space, endogenous differences in the rate of job loss arise. But a key implication of this framework is that labor market frictions distort the location decision of employers. And in particular, too many of the highly productive employers with stable jobs locate in top labor markets like Versailles, which leaves only employers that are not productive enough with jobs that are too unstable in distressed labor markets like Marseille. And the immediate policy implication is that place-based policies like enterprise zone program that target high unemployment areas by incentivizing employers to relocate there raise aggregate welfare. So this is a qualitative justification for enterprise zone programs to then quantitatively assess to what extent the self-selection of heterogeneous employers account for observed unemployment gaps across space. I structurally estimate them all in the third part of the paper using French administrative data. The estimated model accounts for over 90% of the cross-sectional dispersion in local unemployment rates, as well as for the key role of job loss in driving that variation. The estimated model also reveals that if employers made socially efficient location decisions, unemployment gaps across space would close by 80%. And this large reduction indicates first that the location decision of employers is key in understanding spatial unemployment gaps. But it also suggests that there's potentially a lot of scope for policy intervention. And so in the fourth part of the paper, I evaluate the impact of place-based policies with my estimated general equilibrium model. And I find that localized corporate tax credits in high unemployment areas deliver sizable employment and welfare gains by incentivizing marginally more productive employers with more stable jobs to relocate where they're the most needed. The optimal policy raises aggregate welfare by 5%, and I then contrast the optimal policy with the real-world enterprise zone program. Okay, so the plan for the talk today will largely follow these 4 parts, and in the interest of time, I'm going to skip the related literature and jump right into the empirical evidence. So for my main analysis, I'm going to use matched employer-employee data from France because of 2 key advantages. The first one is that it covers a wide cross-section of workers, almost 1 million individuals in every year, and it also tracks workers throughout their employment histories, and so that will allow me to break the sample by fine-grained worker groups and cities, as well as control for worker unobservable characteristics. As a notion of a location or a city, I'm going to use commuting zones, which are partition of the French territory, and which are areas in which most people who live there also work there. And then to define a fine-grained notion of skill in the administrative data, we're going to use a combination of occupation and age information. For some of the validation exercises later on, I'm going to use balance sheet data for the near universe of French businesses. And then I'm also going to show you that my results hold not only in France, but also in the US. And so there I'll use the current population survey for a similar sample of workers. All right, so consistent with the previous literature, I do find large and persistent unemployment gaps across space. But again, in the interest of time, let me not dwell on those and simply jump right into my main empirical exercise, which is to unpack how these differences in local unemployment rates reflect the dynamic process of the inflow into unemployment and the outflow from unemployment, given that this is a dynamic trade conference. And so the change in the unemployment rates in a given city, we're going to characterize it using a very simple stylized accounting model for local unemployment. You know, think of a number of cities C, no migration between cities for now, and constant labor force participation rate in every city. Now, in this admittedly very stylized environment, the change in the unemployment rate in city C between two time periods simply reflects the inflow into unemployment minus the outflow from unemployment. The inflow is the job losing rate, S, like separations into unemployment, times the fraction of workers who are employed in that city. And to that, you have to subtract the outflow from unemployment, which is the job finding rate times the unemployment rate in that city. Now, in steady state, you can rearrange this equation to arrive at the following simple relationship that connects this transformation of the unemployment rate there on the left-hand side to the simple difference between the log job losing rate and the log job finding rate in the given city. So I'm going to use this relationship to check which one of the job losing rate or the job finding rate drives most of the variation. I'm simply going to start by plotting these two terms on the right-hand side against the left-hand side to see which one is varying the most in the cross-section of cities. Then I'm going to show you that the results are robust to contouring for the local composition of every city. So that's going to be for France, and then I'm going to show you that the patterns are the same in the US. So let's start by looking at the job losing rate here on the y-axis, plotted against this transformation of the unemployment rate on the x-axis. So you can see that the data lines up closely along the 45-degree line, indicating that differences in the rate at which workers lose their jobs are the primary determinant of spatial unemployment gaps. And in fact, if you do the same thing for the job finding rate across space, you see that it's comparatively flat across locations. And in a purely accounting sense, the job losing rate drives 86% of the cross-sectional variation. Now, of course, you may think that part of that variation or the role of job loss is driven by compositional differences. Maybe workers are different in different cities or industries are different. So you can do that, account for that possibility by projecting worker level job loss, job finding, and unemployment probabilities on a set of city fixed effects, 232 industry fixed effects, and 300 skill group fixed effects. So what you can see here in green are now the estimated city fixed effects. And you can see that the picture barely changes, even conditional on these fine-grained controls. There's a lot of dispersion in local unemployment risk, and it's mostly coming from the rate at which workers are losing their jobs. And in the paper, I also show that the same logic applies when you control specifically for worker fixed effects. Now, finally, you may also think that these patterns are somewhat specific to France, but you can also check them in US data. So here I'm using the current population survey. Now, because of the much smaller cross-sectional size of the CPS, I have to bin metro errors into 20 groups here to reduce the amount of measurement error. But if you do that and repeat the same exercise, you find a very similar result, that the job losing rate is again the key source of variation driving unemployment gaps across space, also in US data. And so to recap so far, I've argued that there are large and persistent unemployment gaps across space and that they're primarily due to differences in the rate at which workers lose their jobs across space. And that seems to be the case even for similar workers, which indicates that there are systematic differences in the type of jobs that are offered by employers across space, rather than differences simply in the number of jobs. And so now I'm going to turn to the second part of the paper, in which I build a framework to account for these differences in the rate at which workers lose their jobs across space. And that framework emphasizes the key role of employer heterogeneity across cities. So the main ingredients of this theory are going to be, of course, many cities or locations. And in every city, there's going to be a frictional labor market that allows us to think about the dynamic process through which unemployment is determined, so job loss and job finding rates. So that part of the model is going to be fairly standard, but to it, we're going to add a key building block, which is a location choice for heterogeneous employers. So different employers will offer different types of jobs. So some employers will be highly productive, say a high-end restaurant, and they will offer high productivity jobs, say a meat specialist position, while other employers will be less productive. Think of that as a McDonald's franchise, and will offer low productivity jobs, and you can think of that as a burger flipping position. Now, all jobs are subject to some fluctuations, and so sometimes workers fight with their managers, and so all jobs will eventually terminate in this framework. But these initial differences in job productivity will translate endogenously into differences in job stability across employers. And then, because these different employers value differently local labor market conditions for reasons that will become clear in a second, they will sort across cities. And so this sorting will then translate into endogenous differences in the rate at which workers lose their jobs across cities. So I'm going to start by showing you a bare bones version of that economy. And then before we turn to the data, we'll add some quantitative bells and whistles to that framework. All right, so time and space are both continuous here, and the continuum of city sites is indexed by the local TFP of the place that has some exogenous distribution in the economy. And so for the main mechanism today, you can think of these TFP differences as something that's in the soil of the city, if you like, but they're mainly useful to rank and index locations. So you can also think of these, primitive differences across cities as being really, really small, but you can also think of them as reflecting the skill or the human capital of the workers who reside in that city. And in fact, later on in the talk, in the quantitative version, we'll endogenize these TFP differences through the human capital of the residents. But for now, to keep things simple, they're just going to be exogenous. In every city, there's a fixed supply of housing, which results in some land rents that have to be paid to landlords who are absentee and only consume the final good. Workers are all the same and live forever, and they like to consume the final good that's freely traded and is our numeraire here, as well as housing according to a Cobb-Douglas flow utility function, and they discount the future at rate rho. These workers can be either unemployed or employed, and they're freely mobile across cities. In every city, the labor market is fairly standard. There's a single labor market in every city, and workers can only search where they live and during unemployment. Unemployed workers randomly meet vacancies according to a Cobb-Douglas matching function, and they bargain over wages with employers. And then during unemployment, they earn some unemployment benefits or home production that may depend on the city where they live. And here, to keep the exposition simple, is simply going to be linear in TFP, which is also consistent with some salient features of the data. All right, so the economy so far is quite standard. Now we're going to add the key building block, which is this location decision for heterogeneous employers. And so it has 3 steps. First, employers pay an entry cost to operate, and then they learn something about how good they are. I'm going to call that quality, and denoted by Z. And so you should think of Z as really reflecting expected productivity once the employer starts producing. And so this is where employers learn whether they're going to open a meat specialist position or a burger flipping position in a McDonald's franchise. Then once they know their quality, these employers choose where to go, in which labor market to go, and post a single vacancy in their local labor market. Once they match with a worker, they draw their actual match-specific productivity from a conditional distribution that depends on employer quality, which is why quality matters for expected productivity. And again, to keep the exposition simple, I'm going to specialize this distribution to a Pareto distribution where the tail index is inversely related to quality. And so high quality employers draw from a right skewed distribution, and so they're more productive on average.
Adrien, quick question. So do you have some sense in which specific firms are, they're more efficient in producing in certain cities? They have a preference because of, where they source their inputs, or, that they have a specific type of workforce that they need. Do you have something like that in the model?
Yes. So that's coming up. The particular reasons why different employers prefer some cities. It's going to come up in 3 slides. So let me defer to that to then, and please ask me again if it's not clear.
Okay.
All right. So then these employers, if they decide to produce with the worker, produce YT times L, where L is the local TFP of the place, and YT is the match-specific productivity at time T. And so this complementarity in the production function is how these differences in local TFP rank locations from the perspective of employers. And so to partly answer your question, you can think of the differences in input sourcing as being reflected in this local TFP term L. Although it's exogenous and not microfund, it would, once we estimate the model, it will capture such local comparative advantage. The productive unit is the match. And so you can think of these employers in several ways. You can think of them as one worker, one firm, firms that operate a single worker, or as big constant returns to scale firms that operate several matches, potentially with different Z's at the same time. So this is really a job level model that doesn't take a particular stand on the boundaries of the firm. And then over time, productivity fluctuates according to a geometric Brownian motion, match-specific productivity, which is just a continuous time analog of a random walk with drift. And so this productivity process here, because its persistence, will tie together the productivity of a match at a given point in time to the probability of job loss. But more productive matches will be endogenously more stable, but eventually all matches will separate because of the negative drift, so the mall does generate endogenous separations. But because this process is the same across space, differences in the rate of job loss across cities will have to come from something else than the productivity process itself. And so now we're going to solve this location decision problem by backward induction. We're going to start with the location, what an employer in a given city does. So in particular, whenever they keep a worker or let the worker go. Once we know their value, we're going to integrate it against this Pareto distribution to arrive at the expected value of entry of a given employer across all possible cities. So starting with the value of an active employer in a city, it has to reflect several elements. So first, it reflects the flow surplus of the match, which is flow output minus the worker's opportunity cost of operating in that match. And here, because I've already solved out for the wage bargaining, the employer gets only a share 1 minus beta of the flow surplus. Then, because we have productivity fluctuations, there's a continuation value term that comes from changes in future productivity. And so this first derivative here is the continuous time way to encode the negative drift in the productivity process. And the second derivative is simply the contribution of the volatility in the productivity process. Now, of course, this Bellman equation holds only when the match finds it profitable to keep operating, which is when productivity is above an endogenously determined separation threshold, y bar. And this threshold determines when productivity crosses it, there's job loss, the worker transitions into unemployment. And it is jointly determined with the value j according to the value matching condition and the smooth pasting condition. Now, what is convenient in this setup is that the cutoff and the value can be jointly determined in closed form. And so that's going to be useful to then take a step back, integrate this value at every possible match-specific productivity against the starting productivity of a given distribution of a given employer to arrive at the expected value of entry across all possible cities for a given employer. And so if you do that, you can boil down this value of entry of entering the given labor market for employer Z with quality Z to these three terms that each encode a particular force that affects the location decision of employers. So the first term in blue here, and so this is where I can start answering your question a bit more precisely. The first term in blue here simply reflects the general technological complementarity that is embedded in this production function and tells us that more productive, high-quality employers value relatively more places that are better suited for productions, as measured by this local TFP-L, which captures a variety of forces that are not specific to frictional labor markets. And again, it can capture differences in the skill of workers in that city. It can capture differences in input sourcing, or just access to trade routes or anything like that. Now that term here, and so later on we're going to endogenize the human capital part of that term. But in general, this term doesn't generate any interesting policy implications because it doesn't generate any type of externality, and it's not specific to the presence of labor market frictions. The term in red, though, is specific to labor market frictions and is going to generate interesting policy implications. And so this term here shows up because more productive, high-quality employers generate higher profits on average. And so for these guys, it's relatively costlier to wait a long period of time until they start producing with the worker. And so this term here tells us that more productive, high-quality employers prefer cities where it's easier to find workers, as encoded by the vacancy contact rate, Q, which itself depends on the endogenous tightness of the local labor market. And so this term essentially tells us that these more productive employers end up having a higher opportunity cost of time. Now, because in equilibrium, the tightness of the local labor market depends on the pool of vacancies relative to the pool of unemployed workers in that city, I'm going to follow Marshall's terminology and call this complementarity labor market pooling complementarity. And then the third term that affects the incentives to enter in a given particular labor market is simply the expected cost of labor, which can be summarized by the reservation wage in that labor market. But overall, because of these two complementarities with local technology or whatever force you want to put in there, and this local tightness of the labor market, employers will sort across cities because these two complementarities play the role of single crossing conditions, and reservation wages will adjust in the background to sustain that sorting. So you can make this argument precise. Under some condition, there exists a unique steady state, and that in the steady state, there is positive assortative matching between employers and cities as ranked by their local TFP. Now, of course, the tightness of the labor market, which is the source of this labor market pooling complementarity, also endogenously adjusts in the background. And so to understand the role of the pooling complementarity in isolation, it's useful to consider the limiting economy in which all these exogenous TFP differences across cities disappear. So we're going to take all these L's, send them to 1. And so in this limit, cities are ex ante identical. But because of the pooling complementarity, they become exposed different. And in particular, some cities will have high quality employers and high vacancy contact rates. Other cities will have unproductive employers and low contact rates. And so what this result is telling us is that this labor market pooling complementarity is strong enough to create some form of agglomeration through the frictions in labor markets to make cities, ex ante identical cities, different, exposed once the equilibrium is realized. And then in the presence of small ex ante differences in these L's across space, the labor market pooling complementarity is going to provide an important amplification forces. And so then small ex ante differences will result into large exposed gaps across space. But overall, this result simply tells us that employers sort across cities. High productivity employers go to some cities, low productivity employers go to others. And I'm going to connect this sorting back to differences in job losing rates, which was our main empirical object of interest. So in this environment, the job losing rate depends on 3 forces. The first one is the productivity of newly created matches that depends on the equilibrium quality of employers in that city. The second force is simply when these matches break up, so that's the reservation productivity Y bar. And then it depends on the rate at which productivity depreciates from the starting point to the endpoint. And that's on average is governed by the negative drift of the productivity process. Now, to make this argument precise, you have to solve for the invariant distribution of workers across productivities in every city. Now you can do this again in closed form here, which is useful to then derive a tight connection between the rate of job loss and the type of employers who are in a given city. In particular, you can show that the job losing rate is simply inversely related to the equilibrium quality of employers who locate in that city. And so in cities with high rates of job loss, we should have low productive employers. And in cities with low rates of job loss, we should have high productive employers. Then you get similar expressions for the finding rate and the unemployment rate in the city. Okay, so overall, this result ties the sorting of employers to differences in job loss across space. Because we know that employers sort, we should expect big differences in job losing rates across space. Now, before I turn to the normative implications of this theory, I'd like to show you some simple moments in the data that line up with the key mechanisms of this economy. In particular, I want to test this tight negative correlation between labor productivity at the city level and the probability of job loss. So as I discussed, this should hold on average across cities. Cities with high rates of job loss should have low labor productivity, but it should also hold in a distributional sense. In a sense, so through the lens of the model, you get the prediction that in cities with high rates of job loss like Marseille, the entire labor productivity distribution should be shifted to the left in the first order stochastic sense. So you can test that using balance sheet data for the universe of French businesses. So here what I'm doing is on the x-axis showing log labor productivity for 2 groups of cities. The blue group is cities like Versailles with low rates of job loss. Well, in orange, we have cities like Marseille with high rates of job loss. So the vertical bars are the group means. And so you see that in cities like Marseille, labor productivity tends to be about 50% lower than in cities like Versailles, which lines up with the first implication of the theory. Now, you can also compute the entire cumulative distribution of labor productivity within every city group. And so you can see that in cities like Marseille, the labor productivity distribution is indeed shifted to the left in the first order stochastic sense in the data, which lines up with the second implication of the model. And so overall, this picture seems to corroborate the main mechanisms that are inside the model, tying together the productivity of employers in a given city with the probability of job loss. And so having described this, I'm now going to turn to the normative implications of the model.
Sorry, Adrien. Question. Do you have any sense of what happens with the job finding rate? Because I think that it's particularly viable to keep a worker once you have it. So that's why, you know, the job loss rates are low in highly productive cities. I was wondering whether it's also particularly hard to find workers in those cities, or not really, or you know, it's actually.
So the fact that the job finding rate is relatively flat across cities tells us that tightness differences cannot be too big. Otherwise, we should expect big differences in finding rates. So that's telling us that there are some differences in how easy there may be some differences in how easy it is to find workers across place, but this can be massive. Does that answer? So I don't. I'm working on. I mean, I'm like in the Q&A. I'm happy to show you some moments in the data where I kind of infer tightness from some moments in the data, and you're going to indeed see that in Versailles, it's harder to find workers from the perspective of the employer. So that the data also seems to line up with the idea that it's easier to find workers in Versailles for employers, and it's in fact harder in Marseille.
Okay, but just to be sure that in your model, this is also something that you get, right?
Yeah. So that is, I mean, that's directly the case from this pooling complementarity that, in general, the vacancy contact rate is going to correlate positively with the local TFP, and so the top cities will be productive cities where it's easy to find workers, and the opposite is going to be true in the distressed labor markets.
Thanks.
Okay, super. Thanks. All right. So in terms of the normative implications, so as in any random search model, we should expect the standard congestion and separation externalities to operate, and so the overall entry and separation margins can be efficient only if the celebrated Hosius condition holds. But now, because we have geography and many labor markets to choose from for these heterogeneous employers, we get an additional source of externality, which I'm going to call a labor market pooling externality, because it precisely comes from the pooling complementarity that I've described before. And so to understand the nature of this externality, it's useful to consider this intermediate productivity firm, Z, that's choosing between Marseille and Versailles. If it goes to Versailles, it's going to be less productive than the otherwise more productive incumbent there. It gets pooled, however, in the same labor market as these more productive incumbents, and so it gets to contact as many workers than the otherwise more productive guys. The issue is that wages are weighted average of the local labor market conditions and this incumbents match specific productivity, and so they end up not fully pricing this negative spillover that the newcomer is exerting on the otherwise more productive incumbents. And so on it means that the newcomer is essentially free riding the favorable hiring conditions in Versailles. Now this happens throughout the spatial distribution of cities. Everyone has an incentive to try to free ride a little bit the next best labor market, which results on net in excess concentration in the top labor markets. And the question is whether policy can do something about it. So to check that, you have to write down a planning problem, and you can show that the decentralized equilibrium is always inefficient here, regardless of whether the Hosius condition holds or not, precisely because of this labor market pooling externality. But then it turns out that policy can do something about it. And so to restore constraint efficiency, you need a set of place-based policies. And among others, you're going to need place-based profit subsidies. And so cities like Marseille with high rates of job loss will get a large corporate tax subsidy or tax credit relative to a baseline, which will incentivize marginally more productive employers to relocate there, which will reduce the rate of job loss locally and aligns the decentralized equilibrium with the planning allocation. And so this result here provides at least a qualitative rationale for place-based policies like enterprise-owned programs that we see out there that typically provide subsidies to employers in high unemployment areas. Then whether these policies have an effect quantitatively is going to be the subject of the two next parts of this talk. So we're going to have to take them all to the data first before evaluating such policies. And to do that, I'm going to introduce a number of extensions that will allow me to bring them all to the data and match a number of moments we care about. So the first extension is to let cities differ in their exogenous TFP and their amenities to capture joint variation in wages and population. Then I'm going to let housing supply respond elastically to demand to get a better handle on congestion effects. I'm also going to let employers use land in production so that they're also subject to these congestion effects. Then workers will now be imperfectly mobile. Every once in a while, they're going to be allowed to move, in which case they'll draw our usual Fréchet shocks for cities, which will result in an effective migration elasticity 1/epsilon. And then the key extension of them all is to now let workers be different. They will have differences in human capital at birth, but then that will also evolve according to their employment and unemployment histories. And so a little bit like in James' talk yesterday, there's going to be an unemployment scar. As workers transition to unemployment, they're going to gradually lose human capital over time. And so that will let them all capture the idea that in Marseille, the scarring effects from unemployment are particularly severe because workers get repeatedly exposed to unemployment. And that's going to provide an important source of amplification for the welfare gains from place-based policy. And then to let the data kind of tell us where we sit in terms of this externality, I'm going to let employers post many vacancies at a convex cost, which will allow them to undo a little bit the externality. All right, so despite all of these extensions, in fact, virtually all of the tractability of the previous framework continues to hold. And so these employers now sort along a composite index of exogenous TFP and amenities, and they value this composite index, differences in vacancy contact rates, and importantly, differences in the human capital of the workers who reside in the city. And so workers go through this learning and unlearning process over the course of their lifetime here, but still the average human capital in a given city is a simple decreasing function of the local employment rate with the slope depending on the scaring parameter. And so now employers do value human capital differences across. All right, so with this extended model, we can then turn to the data. There are a bunch of parameters to estimate and two distributions. For most of the parameters, you can figure out a recursive scheme. So running a set of regressions one after the other to identify all the parameters without having to simulate, which is kind of convenient to see the identification very transparently. So this is all I'm going to say about the estimation today. In the interest of time, I'm very happy to talk about it in the Q&A, but I'm simply going to jump right into the results. And let me go right here, which is where I'm going to take the estimated model, simulate from it, and see whether the estimated model kind of produces aggregate statistics in terms of local unemployment rates and job losing rates that line up with the data. So first, the aggregate unemployment rate is targeted, so it's not particularly interesting that the estimated model can match it. What is a bit more interesting is that the model can account for roughly the right variation in local unemployment rates across cities. So the standard deviation of local unemployment rates is 2.2 percentage points in the data, in the model, sorry, and 2.3 percentage points in the model. And that's because out of that variation, about the right share is coming from the job losing rate in the model, 85% versus 86% in the data. Now, I haven't shown you the estimation today, but there's no direct constraints on the location choice of employers through the estimation. And so it is not purely mechanical that the model can match these two statistics. And to maybe convince you of that a bit further, I'm going to show you here in this column the results from a re-estimated model that is constraint efficient. So you can think of that model as alternative model as being reflecting the planning allocation or fully directed search model. So it's the same moments, the same estimation procedure, and in fact, you recover extremely similar parameters. But this alternative model generates much lower dispersion in local unemployment rates, that is about 1/5 of its value in the baseline or in the data. And that's because it's generating way too little dispersion in local job losing rates. Why is that the case? It's because the constraint efficient allocation is missing this labor market pooling externality that amplifies the spatial sorting of employers, stretches out the assignment function, which generates in the fully decentralized equilibrium big differences in the rate at which workers are losing their jobs across space. So this is telling us first that it's not mechanical that the model can match those moments, but more importantly, that the presence of these labor market frictions and the labor market pooling externality are important quantitatively to understand spatial unemployment gaps through their mediating role through the location choices of employers. And quantitatively, this magnifies unemployment gaps by a factor 5. And so that's also telling us that there's potentially some scope for policy intervention. And so in the time that I have left, I'm going to discuss two policy counterfactuals in which I evaluate the impact of place-based policies on employment and welfare. I'm going to show you two policy exercises. The first one is the quasi-optimal policy that corrects this labor market pooling externality. So it's going to take the form of a profit subsidy that rises with the local rate of job loss. And so this is a pretty big policy that redistributes about 5% of GDP. And then I'm going to contrast it with the French Enterprise Zone program, which targets high unemployment areas with large corporate tax breaks. So this Enterprise Zone program qualitatively looks like the quasi-optimal policy, but it's just a lot smaller in scale and scope because it redistributed only 0.04% of GDP. Okay, so in terms of the employment effects, so this is starting in the decentralized equilibrium before the policy is implemented. This is a map of France that shows differences in pre-policy unemployment rates across commuting zones with darker shades indicating higher unemployment rates. Once you implement the policy, the dispersion in local unemployment rate collapses by a factor 5, which you can see through the fact that this map is now a lot more uniform because the good employers are leaving Versailles because they're taxed more heavily, and on net, everyone is moving down a little bit, and Marseille gets an influx of more productive employers with more stable jobs, which results in a 5 percentage point decline in the local unemployment rate in Marseille. And then through the structure of the model, you can translate those employment gains into welfare gains. And so here in the left panel, I'm showing you the welfare gains from the quasi-optimal policy in consumption equivalent percent across cities on the x-axis that are ranked by their pre-policy local unemployment rate. And you can see that in initially high unemployment cities like Marseille, these welfare gains can be considerable for the local residents and exceed 20% in consumption equivalent terms. Of course, because the gains here are in part due to the fact that Versailles is losing a little bit of their good jobs, the residents in Versailles are losing from the policy. The enterprise zone program, because it was a lot smaller, achieves welfare gains mostly in the treated locations that are of a more modest order of magnitude, of like a couple percent. Then through the structure of the model, you can ask what fraction of these welfare gains are coming from the reduced scarring effects from unemployment in cities like Marseille. You can see that in those cities that had initially high unemployment before the policy is implemented, the fact that these workers are now able to accumulate a lot more human capital because they're much less frequently scarred by unemployment is an important source of amplification for the welfare gains from such place-based policies. And in the case of the enterprise zone program, it's the majority of these welfare gains. And then you can aggregate through the model, you arrive at the 5% welfare gain for the quasi-optimal policy and a more modest 0.2% for the enterprise zone program. So let me now conclude. In this paper, I've argued that
Maybe Lorenzo can give the conclusions?
Yeah, Adrien, it seems that you froze. But since you were just about to conclude, I think, Lorenzo, are you there?
I'm here.
Great. Why don't you get to it then, I think.
Okay.
You can conclude for him too if you'd like. But
so in this paper, Adrien argues, there we are, Adrien.
All right, good. Yeah, I think Lorenzo still is. Adrien, you're muted. There you go.
Okay, so apologize. I think my internet disconnected me at the 35-minute mark, so I guess my internet was aware of the time limit. So I don't know what you missed from the conclusion, but no. Let me just say that. So the paper I present has these implications for place-based policies that tell us that place-based policies that relocate these marginally more productive employers towards distressed labor markets is beneficial in the aggregate. And now I'm going to leave the floor to Lorenzo. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Adrien. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Okay, great. So you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. And let's see, in principle, I could share my slides. I don't see the chat, but I'll share it to you guys once I finish. Actually, let me see. Chat. Just a second. Chat. Here. Chat. Slides. There we go.
All right, perfect.
Share screen, share screen. Okay, so yeah, I want to start saying basically, thank you so much to the organizers for inviting me to the conference and in particular to discuss this paper. I read this paper before when Adrien was in the market. It's great to have the chance to actually read again with more detail. I guess the discussion allows you to do several things. One, read the paper, and the other one interact with in this case with the person that actually wrote the paper. In this case, is Adrien. I had the chance to interact slightly these days, and that was actually great. So let me summarize kind of in a big picture what this paper is doing. I think this is an amazing example of an impressive job market paper. So the paper has many things. So the first part of the paper, as you know, is he provides new empirical facts. Think about how difficult it is to find new empirical facts, and in particular in this literature. And he comes and shows us that, and not so much the unemployment rate that it varies across geography, that was quite well documented, but the fact that the difference in the job losing rates are the primary source of the spatial unemployment differentials. In fact, he showed that number that 86% of the variation comes from a job losing rate. That's quite amazing. Most students will end up basically having that as a job market paper. They went one step further. he actually provided a mechanism and a general equilibrium model to rationalize this with a model that it's a random matching with heterogeneous employers sorting to different labor markets. He shows, and I'm going to go over this, how the job losing rate is high where employers are unproductive. He's able to reconcile the flatness and the finding rate, flatness related to productivity. And he, in fact, shows that there's a pooling externality, which is crucial to rationalize these findings. In addition, he goes one step further, solves the panel problem, and basically suggests place-based policies to deal with this externality. So he didn't end up there. What did he do next? He actually came and then wrote a quantitative version of the model to quantify the implications of these place-based policies. He finds after you shut down this pooling externality, reduces the spatial variation and employment rate by over 80%. And he didn't end up there. In fact, he came even one step further and basically tried to validate the model by looking at on-target moments to see how well the model is basically targeting those moments. And the model does a very good job. So in conclusion, I think it's an impressive study. I think it's impressive to realize that he did all this in his PhD, in addition to having 2 revised and resubmits in Econometrica. I'm only happy to know that when I went to the market, Adrien was not going to the market at the same time as me, because it would have been very difficult actually to find a job. So I guess the broader point I want to make on this discussion, I don't have like many things to say. I guess the big thing, I mean, what can you add to this paper? I think this paper has it all, as I told you. Great empirical facts, theory, quantitative, and policy, relevant implications. My broad point is going to be more about the cross-sectional time series, which is the following. So most of the literature has mostly focused on the time series dimension. And when you look at the time series dimension, it's all about understanding the time series variation on the unemployment rate. And there, most of the attention has been given on the finding rate. This paper is all about the cross-sectional variation. That's very clear what this paper is doing. It's very clear what this paper is accomplishing. But somehow this paper eventually, either this paper or in basically Adrien's agenda, he has to come back and try to tell us to what extent these cross-sectional results can help us to learn more broadly about the aggregate implications that most of this literature and this literature has focused on the finding rate and the losing rate or the separation rate at the aggregate level. I think he has it all. He has the data to do it. I'm going to talk about that when I talk about the empirical facts. He has the model to do it. I'm going to talk about that, give some suggestions how to do it with the model. He has even the quantitative model to do it. I'm going to talk about that. So that's going to be my discussion. So if there's something that needs to be discussed on this paper, I think it's that. Most of the people have been looking left. He's saying that we should start looking right. If you look at the cross-sectional moments, there's no inconsistency here. I think this is the one, the paper that are given that he's proposing that we should look at a different dimension. He should be the one that at least tells us, discuss briefly in the paper, to what extent once we aggregate these moments, we still get the aggregate moments that everyone actually has been caring about. So that's going to be my broader point on this paper. So the then is going to be basically details on this. On the empirical fact, so 2 things. So one is the persistent regional unemployment rate. This is, I mean, quite well known. I mean, some people have focused on this, like Klein and Moretti, for the case of the US. Puga actually did it for Europe. The OECD actually has studies on this. If you go to the BLS and download the data unemployment by county or download unemployment by MSA, look at the average unemployment rate over 5-year periods, you do find that it's quite persistent. What I'm showing you here is a graph in which the red line basically shows a fitted line. The blue line basically is the 45-degree line. By county, weighted by population, unweighted by population, by MSA, weighted by population, unweighted by population, it is quite persistent. So good. That's the first point. But the new fact comes on the idea of, to understand this, we need to understand the fact that the job losing rate explains most of the variation. There's an interesting paper that I'm citing there, the 2012 paper in the Journal of Monetary Economics, that tries to explain the variation of the unemployment rate across locations using a very different mechanism, related but different mechanism that Adrien is doing. But that paper is not targeting this particular moment, which is key to what Adrien is doing. So this is to challenge somehow, at first sight, Hall's view that explain the change in the job finding rate is what actually matters. But again, Hall, going back to the same point, is mostly about the business cycle, not this paper. So the time variation in national employment rate is mostly driven by variation in the job finding rate, not the cross-sectional. So what I would like, I think will be easy to do for you, which it would be great to show empirically with your data, your DADS data, when you match with the LFS and using the basic blank dots idea to impute the transitions. Once you aggregate your data, that at the macro level, we're still seeing the same patterns that we actually see across. So that's one. That's regarding the empirics. Regarding the theory, extremely elegant in a very tractable model. In fact, you can actually almost solve all the model by hand. And I think the Pareto case is quite insightful. It's the one that he has in the paper. He shows in the appendix that you can actually extend this, but the Pareto case at the end is the one more relevant empirically. Look at the intuition, which is an employer has a productivity draw, the C, and then after he matches, he's going to draw from a Pareto distribution, which basically the shape of the Pareto, which determines the skewness of the distribution, depends on that productivity. So what's going on? There's positive associative matching. There's an employer that basically it's in a market that is less productive. He's drawing after he matches from a productivity that is from a distribution that is less skewed. So therefore, most likely there's going to be more separations in less productive markets. That's exactly how you get at the first equation, that the separation rate is negatively related to productivity. This is brilliant. This is basically by making this assumption of the Pareto, and that the shape of the Pareto is all determined by this the shape of the Pareto is determined by this productivity of the employer. He gets it automatically. Now, how do you get defining rate? That was actually more involved. Max's question actually was related to this. Defining rate depends on two things, on the worker contact rate and the contact to job probability. Now, in a direct search model, you will not actually get the finding that he gets that is almost flat. It's the fact that you have random search and that you have this pooling externality, if you want this pooling complementarity actually, that actually generates an externality, that a more productive actually employer will actually benefit from going to a place with a higher vacancy contact rate, which basically means that he actually will benefit less from a place with a higher worker contact rate. That means that places with higher worker contact rate has less productive employers. Great, so that basically puts the defining rate similar pattern as the separation. However, how do you get the other mechanism? Is that condition on a worker contact rate is places with higher productivity have a higher contact to job probability. That's the second thing. It's brilliant because of the Pareto and the assumptions that they both almost cancel out and you get this flatness. Once you add the direct search, the first channel basically disappears and you start getting basically a pattern that resembles much similar to the separation rate. Now, do we have direct search in the data? Do we have random search in the data? He claims that the fact that we see flat defining rates speaks to a random search model. And that's actually how he proceeds. Now, an important observation about this is that I would like to understand is what are the macro implications of this model if you have shocks to this drift? Look at the drift of the distribution is affecting the separation rate across every single location. What would happen at the aggregate, going back to the same point as before, if we were to aggregate this model, I would like to understand what are the aggregate implications of the separation rate, aggregate implications on the contact rate, on the finding rate, 5-ish minutes left, perfect. Aggregate implication on the separation rate, aggregate implication on the finding rate from your model. Also try to understand what happens if you have shocks, like common shocks like the drift, what would happen to these implications? That would be my second thing. The third thing is related to the place-based policies. I think it's, as I said, he didn't stop there. He continues to solve the planner's problem. He's getting a set of policies. One, basically what it means, one basically that is suggested in this theory is that labor needs to be taxed more in relatively lower productive locations. That intuition already came on Klein and Moretti's paper. Here is coming from something completely different. He doesn't focus on that one too much. It doesn't seem to be very policy, if you want, I don't know. So think about basically telling, okay, I don't want to talk about that. But he focuses on the other one, which is more empirical relevant, which is the one that subsidizes locations, entry into locations with actually more productivity. What he finds after he actually takes the model quantitatively and basically shuts down the pooling externality, that the spatial variation at employment basically drops by 80%. So I would like to learn more about the disaggregated effect. Not so much about the welfare effects, but I would like to know how the allocations actually change in that economy. This truly, I think, depends on the fact that you have a planner basically with equal weights across each of these locations. Maybe I'm asking too much for this paper, but we need to understand if you start actually having a planner that actually weights location differently. And again, I would like to know, once you do it in this experiment, after you do this, what happens to the aggregate separation and finding rate? in this model after we move to the first best. Last point, I had to say something about geography. In the quantitative model, so what's geography in this paper? This geography in this paper is basically defined on the fact that you have this housing, which is a local factor. There's no trade frictions, which is something that we always think about as a first order dimension of geography, which is trading across space is costly, distance matter, and the other is migration cost. There is a migration cost, which is you take up a zone, basically draw, and after that, you can move, but there's nothing about basically distance, there's nothing about geography in terms of the mobility. I think he can do it in the quantitative model. That would only, I think that would affect the aggregate results. I would like to see if it's possible, right? And I think it is possible because the fact that his model is so tractable by making the right assumptions that I think he can do this. So bottom line, let me conclude here. I think this is an amazing paper, a great paper. I think it's teaching us something new about spatial unemployment. And if you haven't read it, I suggest that you actually read this. Thank
you. Okay, great. So we have 7 minutes, kind of for people to do whatever they need to do before the next talk. I think we'll just leave the chat open for anybody who wants to ask some more questions of Adrien or to chat with Lorenzo, and then we will reconvene at 2 o'clock.
Well, let me just take 30 seconds to thank Lorenzo very much for the discussion, and I'm impressed how in how much detail you've read the paper. I really appreciate that. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Otherwise, I can also discuss some of the points that Lorenzo raised. I think you're absolutely right that the next step is to think about what these spatial patterns can teach us about aggregates. And I mean, in fact, that's a project I'm starting right now. And so there's this old idea going back at least to Scheimer 2007 that he was struggling with this unemployment volatility puzzle at the aggregate level and tried to write matching malls in disaggregated markets where there's limited mobility between local markets, space, occupations, and things like that to help rationalize unemployment volatility. And it's true that if you took this mall and fed in aggregate shocks, you would partly solve the unemployment volatility puzzle through those channels, because as soon as workers are imperfectly mobile, then if you feed an aggregate shock in there, it's going to, unemployment differences are going to start moving very differently in different cities. First, because workers can't move. Then there's the fact that you mentioned also that the productivity distribution is less skewed in the structurally high unemployment areas. And so a given aggregate shock is going to push more workers into unemployment there. So that's exactly what I'm starting to do over the summer, is to check whether unemployment rates in structurally high unemployment cities are more cyclical or not, and whether that's coming from higher inflow rates or higher outflow rates. And then you can also think of doing the same exercise not only across space but across skill groups or industries to see which of those margins is contributing most to aggregate unemployment volatility. So that's exactly where I want to go, and so I'm very happy that you brought it up. So then you also mentioned like a little bit about looking at the aggregate effects after the policy is implemented. So it's a little bit there in the paper. It's not emphasized so much. So I'll make sure I emphasize that more when I reread the paper. And the last point that you mentioned, the trade frictions and the bilateral migration frictions. So that's an excellent point, and I would love to put them in. I think I agree with you that it's possible. It's just that it's gonna increase the dimensionality of how you solve the problem quite a bit. So the hard thing is the bilateral migration frictions, because it starts interfering with the human capital distribution everywhere in the model. The trade frictions, that should be maybe feasible, and I agree that it would be very nice to see the effects. In terms of the positive implications, when you estimate the mall, kind of market access on the if you had a trade side of a mall, is going to be summarized in this local TFPL. So in some sense, if you just want to do accounting after you estimate the mall, that's okay to not mall these trade frictions. Of course, once you do counterfactual, once you start microfunding where this TFP is coming from, that is going to start moving around, and so that would be super interesting. It's hard to get good data in city-to-city trade usually. So in France, I think it's hard. In the US, I think your paper your paper on the China shock is, I think, at the state level, if I remember correctly. And the other papers I know that do it at a city level in the US, I think they project the state level trade at the city level somehow. I'm not exactly sure. It would be a little bit challenging to get good data to discipline those trade flows in general, but I agree that would be very interesting. So thanks again so much for the great discussion.
Adrien?
Mm-hmm.
One question I had about this time series implication. I mean, my very rough intuition that doesn't really do justice to the whole model at all, but is that there's some jobs that just really don't have that much surplus, and so that little glitches at the mean that you get rid of the worker because it was hardly work. Maybe the worker didn't even like flipping burgers very much, so they're quickly just get out of that job. And that would suggest, I think, what you just mentioned, which is that when there's a shock to the aggregate, those are going to get wiped out quickly because they're kind of on the margin anyway.
Absolutely.
Whereas these high surplus jobs, which probably are going to stay around.
That's absolutely correct. Then it also becomes a little bit of a challenge to then have the mall. Forget about space. Suppose you just have differences in surplus. Then the shape of this invariant distribution close to the threshold kind of starts mattering a lot, because you don't want the separation rate to drive too much of the cyclical variation if you feed an aggregate shock in the mall, because we know that that's not the case in the data. So I mean, as Lorenzo said, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of interesting stuff to do, and trying to reconcile how to understand the fact that in the cross section, it seems the job losing rate is driving most of the variation, and that's true also not only across space but also across skill groups and industries as well. And the fact that in the aggregate is the job finding rate that's moving on. And you're absolutely right that how many marginal jobs you have is going to matter for the cyclicality of the job losing rate, and you don't want to have too much of that going on in the data. In your model, too much to data.
Right.
Could I ask you a question?
Yes.
I'm just wondering if you looked at the data and all about how kind of mobile firms are, because if there's kind of big frictions to the mobility of firms, then the actual optimal distribution of the firms could be history dependent. And maybe the planner wouldn't want to do as much as your analysis is suggesting.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. So here, I mean, jobs really are freely mobile in the sense that they can, frictionlessly reallocate across space. So that's a little bit of an extreme assumption, but it's where that's where kind of most of the tractability is coming from. If you started, reducing that, so you could add some form of taste shocks on the, you could imagine these jobs as being entrepreneurs and they have taste shocks. So Lorenzo, in fact, has a very nice paper where both workers and firms have these Frichet shocks, and so that generates some elasticity on the firm side as well. And we know that firms at least don't respond, completely elastically to these differences. These migration elasticities on the firm side are at least as low as on the worker side. So that's a little bit of an extreme assumption. Now, the fact that this is a job level model and not a firm level model also helps a little bit in getting around that difficulty, in the sense that it doesn't have to be that firms are moving here. It could be every plant stays where it is, and plants are just adjusting what fraction of good jobs or bad jobs they're having inside the plant. So in that sense, the way the model is formulated is not directly in contradiction with what we know about firm mobility, because there's no such thing really as a firm in the model. But I agree. I think a very interesting next step would be to precisely model the role of firms and model firms, establishments, and so Esteban is pushing that frontier with one of his recent papers, and try to think precisely about how these job differences in job productivity are sorted into establishment, or sorted into firms, or sorted in space. In particular, if you want to take these policy recommendations seriously, the fact that firms can shift profits inside across multiple establishments will be quite important in terms of writing down the policy that is immune to such profit shifting incentives on the firm side. So you're absolutely right that that's a very important kind of next step. Maybe not in this paper because it's already quite long, but certainly in the future I think it's important before taking the policy recommendations really seriously.